Terrorism has been the scourge of the 20th century, and there is no sign of it letting up in the new millennium. On August 15th, 1998, a car bomb devastated the town of Omagh in Northern Ireland, killing 28 people and wounding more than 200. A radical splinter group of the IRA claimed responsibility for the attack. In 1996, 60 people were killed in Israel, the victims of Hamas suicide bombers. Even the United States has not been immune. In April 1995, a truck filled with homemade explosives destroyed the Alfred Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people died in the attack, which shocked and convulsed the nation. As the new millennium begins, the trademarks of today's terrorists are ominous. They are more experienced, more sophisticated, more ruthless and cold-blooded. This is the story of how terrorism got that way. At the end of the 20th century, terrorism has changed so radically that it is extremely difficult to define. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin defined it most simply. The purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. But this is too simple. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a terrorist as anyone who attempts to further his views by a system of coercive intimidation. The U.S. Department of Defense offers perhaps the most accurate definition: the unlawful act of force or violence against individuals or property, to coerce or intimidate governments or societies to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives.
The definition of the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it is the use of force or violence to bring about intimidation or change to a government or a civilian population using force and using violence. And that definition is consistent, and it is one that we see and apply our application of the rule of law to.
Over the course of history, terrorism has been the weapon of choice for many. The poor and desperate, tyrants to eliminate opposition and consolidate their power. Movements fighting to liberate their homeland from foreign rule. Political radicals and religious fanatics on a deadly mission to change society. But terrorism is not new. In every culture and every religion there has been terrorism. It is a worldwide and ancient phenomenon. More than 2,000 years ago, religious fanatics engaged in acts of terrorism. The word zealot can be traced to a Jewish sect in 66 to 72 AD. They fought the Roman Empire's occupation of what is now Israel. The zealots waged a ruthless campaign of assassination, relying on the Sika, a primitive dagger. The word assassin was the name of a radical Muslim Shia sect in the 11th and 12th centuries. They committed acts of terrorism to repel the Christian crusaders from the Middle East. Violence for the assassins was a divine duty, a deeply religious sacrificial act. If the terrorist died during the attack, he would be rewarded as a martyr and ascend immediately to a glorious heaven. This same concept of self-sacrifice and suicidal martyrdom can be seen today in many terrorist groups. We have come full circle. Most terrorist groups today are religiously motivated. What is frightening is that they will soon have access to advanced weapons of mass destruction.
We are now on the eve of a new period. A new period which is characterized, A, by a growth of fanaticism, and what's more important, by the much greater access to a few groups of people to means of mass destruction. In other words, a few people, perhaps in the near future, will be able to kill not dozens, not 300 people, but thousands, tens, and maybe hundreds of thousands.
Where did it all begin? Who were the mentors of the 20th century terrorists? How did we arrive at this frightening juncture in history? To most of us, the French Revolution means liberté, égalité, fraternité. But there is another legacy: terror. It was then that the word terrorism was used for the first time. The concept of systematic intimidation began with the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Maximilien Robespierre and his Jacobean party controlled France for 2 years, 1793 and 1794, by brutally suppressing all opposition through terror. They were the first in modern times to use systematic violence to eliminate their enemies and totally dominate the entire population. Their example would be followed later by Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler. Robespierre was a fanatic, intolerant of all opposition. Those who opposed him were declared enemies of the people, who deserved nothing but death. He viewed terror as a moral crusade.
Robespierre starts out as the embodiment of this notion of public safety, all-out commitment to save the revolution. It's sort of the defensive, pragmatic view of the terror. But then, in the course of those months, a different emphasis emerges. Robespierre becomes the advocate for the linkage of terror and virtue. There's a famous epigram that he pronounced. He said something like, "Virtue without terror is impotent. Terror without virtue is evil."
Robespierre knew that the success of terrorism depends on the fear it creates. And because fear is essential, so is publicity. Robespierre made a spectacle of the beheading of Marie Antoinette and staged other public executions.
There are 17,000 death sentences for what we would call either rebellion or political crimes of various kinds. And this makes up the most sort of public and well-known aspect of the terror, because all of these 17,000 people who are sentenced to death go to death on the guillotine, which is very specifically a public ritual of execution, in many cases a kind of spectacle, which in fact had started with the execution of the king.
The guillotine, invented by Dr. Joseph Guillotin as a humane method of execution, became a chilling symbol of the French Revolution. During the reign of terror, in just 2 years, thousands of so-called traitors were guillotined, including peasants, workers, and aristocrats. Many more thousands were killed outside the tribunals, murdered by angry mobs. Others perished of disease and malnutrition in jails. Finally, the terror caught up with Robespierre himself. Political opponents arrested him and sentenced him to death. On July 28, 1794, he went to the guillotine. Robespierre's reign of terror is considered the first example of state-sponsored terrorism in history. But it would not be the last.
100 years of terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
In the mid-1870s, Karl Marx described Russia as the France of the 19th century. And indeed, pre-revolutionary France and Russia shared striking parallels. The Tsar's rule was absolute and autocratic. The peasants were oppressed and lived in crushing poverty. They were forced to work in subhuman conditions with inadequate food supplies. Russia was ripe for revolution. It almost came in 1880. The Winter Palace at St. Petersburg, the lavish residence of Tsar Alexander II, the absolute ruler of Russia. It is here that the Tsar and his wife threw glittering parties for Russia's elite. One such party was underway on the night of February 5th, 1880. But one floor below, a sinister plot was unfolding. For the last few months, palace cabinetmaker Stefan Kulturin had been hoarding more than 100 pounds of explosives in the basement, below the palace's dining room. Upstairs, the merriment was already in full swing. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Kulturin positioned his bomb directly under the dining table and lit the fuse. "11 guests were killed, 56 were severely wounded. But the target himself, Alexander II, was late for dinner and narrowly escaped death. Kulturin was exposed as one of a small group of revolutionaries, Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will.
They believed that by toppling the government, in this case the government meant the autocrat, almost spontaneously a new government would come into being. The core group of the Narodnaya Volya seemed to believe that they would themselves take over the government, and they'd become a smaller, coherent, disciplined dictatorship, ultimately. Their idea was that by assassinating the Tsar at this particular juncture, then you can put the whole system into crisis, because the Tsar was, after all, the government.
They introduced to the repertoire of terrorism the notion of individual terrorism. That is to say, you are not putting just a bomb in a restaurant or in a bus. You are going after individuals who are directly responsible for the suffering of the people. It is still terrorism, but it is very selective terrorism.
A year later, the terrorists tried again. March 1st, 1881. Alexander II was returning to his winter palace after attending a military parade. The convoy was a glittering testament to the Tsar's vast wealth and power. He was satisfied with a wave of recent army, court, and land reforms, and confident that Russia was moving in the right direction. The convoy approached the grounds of the palace, unaware of Ignatiy Grinevsky, a People's Will activist who waited by the roadside. When the smoke cleared, 20 people were dying or wounded. Among the dying were the terrorist and his victim. Three hours after he had left his palace, Tsar Alexander II was dead. The act of political terror shocked the royal family and thrust the nation into a state of turmoil. The zealots believed they had ignited a social revolution.
For the most part, in the immediate terms, the assassination of Alexander II backfired. It had the opposite effect of what they would have expected.
There was no revolution. Alexander III replaced his father as Tsar, and several months after the assassination, the ringleaders were executed before a crowd of 100,000 people. Despite the public executions, the anarchists of Narodnaya Volya were not discouraged.
Narodnaya Volya was influenced in some ways by the sense of the ascetic revolutionary who was fully dedicated full-time to the revolutionary cause. It's the professional revolutionary, which would be picked up later on by Lenin, who in 1902 wrote What is to be Done, which was about the completely dedicated full-time professional revolutionary. This is a person who shuns personal relations, probably doesn't have a very exciting private life, is dedicated full-time to revolutionary activity, whatever it might take, sacrificing all personal wealth to the revolutionary cause. At the same time, there's a sense of martyrdom and a sense that even if you're caught and even if you're executed, if anything, You've actually put yourself down in history and you've given yourself to a good cause.
Historians know today that this generation was the generation of the first martyrs. In many respects, they introduced the idea of martyrdom and the idea of revolution to the consciousness and culture of Russia. Martyrs create a legend, and what is more importantly, they create a commitment in the next generation. You see it in Ireland, you see it in Russia, you see it everywhere. The people who survive feel that they are committed to the memory of their fallen members, of their friends. And this commitment is so strong that even if you don't have any chance of success, still the next generation would do it because they are bound by this blood.
Members of the People's Will were believed to be the world's first revolutionary terrorists. They used terrorism to bring about political change, whereas Robespierre used it to eliminate opposition. Sergei Nechayev, born in 1847, became Russia's disciple of revolutionary terrorism. He would influence every terrorist that followed. The most important legacy of Nechayev was his Catechism of the Revolutionary. It would become the Bible of 20th century terrorists, from Lenin to Eldridge Cleaver to George Habash. Our task, Nechayev wrote, is terrible, total, universal, and merciless destruction. Only through terrorism could the revolutionary achieve his long-term strategic objective, to destroy every object, root, and branch, to annihilate all state traditions, orders, and classes.
There were people who wanted freedom, or at least reforms. And if you happen to be, if you had the misfortune to be a citizen of the Tsarist Russia, there was no democracy. If you disagreed with the government, you could not vote, you could not make speeches, you could not write. The only possibility to express your dissent was throwing bombs, shooting.
After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the People's Will tried to assassinate the Tsar's successor, Alexander III. They failed, and all the terrorists were hanged. Anarchist terrorism would dominate the headlines for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th. In the years between 1890 and 1908, anarchists murdered Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary, King Umberto of Italy, and King Carlos I of Portugal. A wave of anarchists drifted into the United States between 1890 and 1910 during the enormous influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Italy. Americans saw them as a threat to democracy, stability, and their way of life. The anarchists spread terror by setting off a series of bombs on Wall Street, the bastion of American capitalism.
They called it propaganda by deed. Throwing a bomb was propaganda by deed. Why? Because people would hear about it, would get frightened, would ask, why do these people do these things? So that was the second kind of terrorism, quite different from the one inside dictatorships such as Russia.
In 1901, President William McKinley of the United States was assassinated by an anarchist who had recently emigrated from Hungary. Anarchist anti-government activity triggered a backlash against immigrants in the United States. Suspected anarchists were rounded up and deported. The anarchists never succeeded in bringing down a government, but in 1914, one act of terror changed the course of history: the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife at Sarajevo. The murder of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist ignited the First World War.
100 years of terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel. The History Channel now returns to 100 Years of Terror.
For 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, Europe was torn apart by the First World War. But terrorism did not disappear. The Russian Revolution in 1917 began with sporadic acts of violence, which ultimately developed into a well-orchestrated campaign of terror. Terrorism found a new master who pushed it to new heights. His name, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, also known as the Red Prince of Terror. Lenin was the father of 20th century terrorism.
One of the things that we find in terrorist movements, especially among educated leaders, is that they read the books and try to learn from the memories and experience of other terrorist organizations.
Lenin was a passionate student of both Robespierre and Nechayev. He considered Nechayev a genius with a special talent for organization, and he paid homage to Robespierre. Without Jacobean violence, he insisted, dictatorship of the proletariat are words emptied of all content. In Lenin's view, terror must not consist of isolated, unrelated events, but must be a vast mass action, well coordinated by a central revolutionary authority.
But where the real change takes place, and where a Lenin in the 20th century is different from a Nechayev in the 19th century, is that Lenin is thinking in terms of masses. And this is where the real change takes place, and you can see Lenin as part of a much bigger change. When Lenin says, practice terror against the bourgeoisie, he means practice terror against entire classes. Go after the entire class. Practice class terror if need be. And sure enough, after the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917 and 1918, methodically went about terrorizing what they considered to be the bourgeoisie. Rounding up hostages, shooting the hostages if need be, in order to terrorize the rest of the bourgeoisie and any other possible class enemies.
His opportunity came during the Russian Revolution in 1917. In March, strikes and riots erupted in the capital, St. Petersburg. The army, fed up with the First World War, mutinied, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. In October, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power. The revolutionaries captured most of the government offices, stormed the Winter Palace, and arrested bourgeois moderates. Lenin promised violence, death to all his foes. No revolutionary government can avoid using capital punishment against the exploiters, landlords, and capitalists. Lenin did not hesitate to order the execution of the Tsar and his entire family.
The most important transformation for Lenin took after the revolution, when he discovered terrorism is a very good means of, first, destroying the enemies, second, destroying the class enemies of the government, and eventually of even starting a regime, a socialist regime, on your own.
On December 20th, 1917, Lenin established a security agency called the Cheka as the instrument of Bolshevik terror. The Cheka later became the KGB. Executions intensified immediately. The campaign of violence was called the Red Terror. Lenin's goal was to destroy the bourgeoisie as a class. The Red Terror became a bloodbath and reached its peak during the civil war that followed the Russian Revolution. Cold, like a steel blade, with no compassion. That's how a colleague described Lenin as he ordered mass executions. It is better to destroy 100 innocent people than to let one guilty one escape, he declared. If for the sake of communism it is necessary for us to destroy 9/10 of the people, we must not hesitate.
Government violence from above, state violence, terrorism, but terrorism exerted not by small groups of people, but by the state, became the prevailing policy. So here we have, but this was present in Lenin's days, became far more pronounced under Stalin, and so much so that propaganda and terrorism became the two main pillars of the Soviet regime.
In 1922, the Bolsheviks defeated the counter-revolutionaries. Lenin created a law legitimizing terror. Then he suffered a stroke. A year later, on January 24th, 1924, he died. But there would be no respite from the terror.
We know for a fact that all the terrorism that was later on used by Stalin was initiated by Lenin. Stalin, with his paranoia, expanded. He made terrorism a fact of life of every Russian. But many of the asylums, the concentration camps, and also the execution of class enemies were introduced by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
Lenin's successor was the brutal, ruthless, paranoid Joseph Stalin. During his rule, the terror would reach new heights.
100 Years of Terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel. 100 Years of Terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
Far away from the desolate, barren steppes of Russia, the Emerald Isle, Ireland, was ruled by Britain. Each generation in Ireland had seen assassinations, bombings, and uprisings, all aimed at achieving independence. Early in the 20th century, Irish nationalists openly proclaimed the Sinn Féin party. Sinn Féin is the Gaelic phrase for "we ourselves." The secret military wing of Sinn Féin was organized as the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. During the First World War, the IRA launched an intensive terrorist campaign against the British. In 1914, the First World War raged in Europe. The British, at war with Germany, had no time for the Irish problem. But the Irish nationalists saw it as an opportunity and stepped up their terrorist campaign to drive the British out of Ireland. Britain's enemy, Germany, became Ireland's friend. A German ship, the Auld, navigated the Irish coast with a shipment of arms for the newly formed Irish Republican Army. The planned rebellion, the Easter Uprising, would depend on this crucial shipment of weapons. But the ship never reached shore. The Royal Navy intercepted it, captured the crew, and later executed them. The IRA was not deterred and vowed to continue its rebellion during Easter week, 1916. Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, was a beautiful spring day. The sun was shining over Dublin. A crowd of Irish nationalists gathered in front of the main post office. Members of the IRA in gray-green uniforms carrying guns were hidden inside the building to provide protection if British troops tried to disrupt the gathering. At a few minutes past 12 noon, Patrick Pearse, a poet, stood at the entrance to the post office and surveyed the crowd. He unfolded a large piece of paper and began to read from it. It was a proclamation signed by the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic, declaring the creation of the newly independent Irish Republic. The crowd cheered when Pearse finished reading.
Patrick Pearse was hung up on the idea of a blood sacrifice, making a statement even if it meant dying. He had some strange views. He rejoiced in the fact during the World War I that the soil of Europe was being warmed with the good red wine of the battlefields and otherwise blood. Something of a mystic, Patrick Pearse. And he regarded himself, I think, as a Christ-like figure giving up his life for his people.
Among the leaders that fateful day, Eamon de Valera, who would later become Ireland's first Prime Minister, and Michael Collins, a charismatic officer just beginning his career in the IRA.
De Valera was not a man to make emotional judgments. He must have been of the opinion that this would light a spark in the rest of Ireland. Collins, also a very pragmatic man. He must also have been of the opinion that this would be the spark needed to gather more support for a more militant approach to the resolution of Ireland's demand for independence.
On the roof of the post office, several Irish nationalists hoisted a green, white, and orange flag. The Irish Republic was born, but its days were numbered. Around the city of Dublin, 1,500 men of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and its young commander Michael Collins prepared for the worst. As a troop of British cavalry probed their defenses, IRA gunmen fired the first shots in the uprising, killing 4 British soldiers. The the British responded with a massive show of force to put down the rebellion. Artillery pounded the buildings seized by the IRA, smashing the walls and setting them ablaze. HMS Helga, a British gunboat, was brought in, and its huge cannon shells rained on Dublin, causing widespread destruction. Acrid black smoke hung over the city as fierce battles raged between British troops and the IRA. By Thursday, the post office and many other buildings were burning. Under the heavy British artillery and crossfire, the IRA's fighting units were isolated and in disarray. Each unit fought for its own survival. The roar of artillery shells and heavy machine guns was deafening. By noon on Saturday, April the 29th, without any hope of turning the battle around, the rebels decided to surrender. The British demanded an unconditional surrender, and the IRA complied. On Saturday afternoon, April 29th, with Dublin still burning, the rebels were taken away by British soldiers and thrown in prison.
The 1916 uprising can be described as the triumph of failure. Militarily, it was a fiasco. Only about 1,500 people were involved in it. However, the Crown forces in turn are imprisoned approximately 2,500 to 3,000 people, some of whom had no connection with it whatsoever. So that tended to turn public opinion against the Crown. That was where they really made their major diplomatic and political mistake.
To crush the spirit of the fledgling militant Irish Republic, the British imposed harsh restrictions on the movement of all the citizens. Secretly, the leaders of the rebellion were brought before military tribunals, found guilty, and sentenced to death. All were held in Dublin's Kilmainham prison. Early on the morning of May 3rd, 1916, just 4 days after their surrender, 3 of the leaders of the rebellion were rounded up from their prison cells by British soldiers, escorted by a priest. They walked silently to the execution yard. Among the rebels executed on that day was the man who declared Ireland's provisional independence on Easter Sunday, Patrick Pearse. 13 others were executed over a period of 5 days. Eamon de Valera escaped with his life.
Eamon de Valera, who later became the president of Ireland and was one of the leaders of the Rising, the 1916 Rising, was born on 42nd Street, I believe, where the Chrysler building is at the moment. That was his home. In fact, being an American citizen saved him from execution after he was captured when the Rising was defeated by the British.
Britain's brutal measures backfired and stirred Irish nationalism. Of those who escaped the death penalty, more than 1,300 men and 5 women were imprisoned in England. Among them, Michael Collins, who ended up in an internment camp in North Wales.
Michael Collins escaped a major punishment somewhat fortuitously. He happened to walk across a room when prisoners were being divided, and he wasn't included in those who were singled out for more severe punishment.
In prison, Collins forged friendships with prisoners, sharing his goal of Irish independence. Having failed against the British military, he recruited loyal revolutionaries to wage a new clandestine war, a war of surprise and stealth, which he called selective terrorism. On Christmas Day, 1916, Michael Collins and his fellow prisoners were granted amnesty and set free. They returned to Ireland as heroes.
In our next hour, a Valley girl runs for her life from Saddam Hussein on Escape.
The official network of every millennium. This is TimeLab 2000. In 13th century India, there arose a Hindu sect which worshipped Kali, the goddess of destruction. The sect preyed on wealthy travelers to sacrifice to their goddess and as a good source of revenue. They lured their victims to secluded spots, snuck up from behind, and then strangled them with a scarf. When the British colonized India, they began a crackdown on the group, and in the 1830s arrested more than 3,000 men. The last known member was executed in 1882. The name of the group? The Thugs. For the History Channel, I'm Sam Waterston.
The History Channel now returns to 100 Years of Terror.
Before launching his campaign of selective terrorism against Britain, Michael Collins hides in a Dublin flat to study why previous Irish uprisings failed. He came to the conclusion that the IRA needed a first-class intelligence service. He placed his men everywhere, on the streets and in pubs, even in the deepest recesses of Britain's intelligence center, Dublin Castle. He perfected Nechaev's compartmentalized system of terror, where a cell member only knows enough to perform one deadly task, never to link it with anyone else.
Michael Collins was responsible for destroying British intelligence in Ireland. But he was responsible for infiltrating the British intelligence operation and ultimately practically destroying it in Ireland. And in that sense, he was extremely significant in the course of the War of Independence. He had his own group within Dublin who were responsible for assassinating key figures of the British intelligence establishment, and this they did very successfully. He had spies within the deepest recesses of British intelligence in Dublin Castle. In fact, his second cousin was a secretary entrusted with encoding, decoding, sending and receiving the top secret military dispatches between London and Dublin and vice versa. The British did not know she was his cousin.
On January 21st, 1919, Michael Collins launched his campaign of terror. IRA terrorists began assassinating policemen, members of the Royal Irish Constabulary. They bombed police barracks, ambushed British soldiers, and destroyed property of the English and Irish sympathizers with English rule. Collins' war of selective terrorism was in full swing. Now, every British officer was in danger. For 2 years, the IRA waged a guerrilla war against what it saw as British occupiers. Ireland was consumed by violence as terrorist attacks became more cold-blooded and ruthless.
Guerrilla tactics, hit and run, quick strike, get out of there. Don't face the enemy in a stand-up battle. They have greater firepower, they have greater manpower, they're going to destroy you. So he was at least one of those who had a large part of formulating the tactics of hitting the police barracks, police stations, the public buildings, the organs of civil administration, the courthouses.
In March 1920, the British dispatched a special force to Ireland, created to terrorize the terrorists. They became known as the Black and Tans. Consisting of many ex-servicemen, they soon made life a nightmare for the IRA and the population that supported it. When the IRA attacked Britain's police or military, the Black and Tan struck back immediately, burning homes of known IRA members and their sympathizers. The battle soon became a savage war of terrorism and counterterrorism. By the spring of 1920, both sides realized that the other could not be defeated. The British government and public were uncomfortable with the depths of the horror. For its part, the IRA was exhausted and short of men and munitions.
One of the factors in bringing about the demand for a truce was revulsion in Britain at the tactics of their own forces. And it was the IRA's success in keeping it up at a certain pitch. They knew they could never win the battle, but they could keep the situation at boiling point, keep the pot simmering all the time.
On the morning of October 11th, 1921, a ceasefire was declared, and formal negotiations began in London. Michael Collins led the Irish delegation. After 2 months of deadlock, Britain threatened war unless the Irish agreed to British terms. On December the 6th, 1921, Michael Collins signed a far from perfect Anglo-Irish treaty. According to the terms of the treaty, the 6 Protestant counties in the north would remain under direct British rule. Ireland's 26 Catholic counties in the south would be known as the Irish Free State, with Dominion status, like Australia or New Zealand. The Free State would have its own parliament and be completely self-governing, but must swear an oath to the English king. This enraged IRA radicals who considered it a betrayal. The Battle of Ireland had taken a tragic toll. In just 18 months, more than 500 soldiers and policemen, 700 IRA volunteers, and 700 civilians lost their lives.
These were the brave men who went out and set themselves up against an empire, made a futile but very brave, noble sacrifice. It was a part of the mythology, the martyrdom. Another generation had produced its quota of heroes for Ireland. The proclamation of 1916 is one which is read at practically every Republican commemorative gathering over the gravesides of the people who died in 1916 and through the war of 1919 to 1921, and over the gravesides of those who have died since in Republican activities.
Michael Collins was a deeply troubled man. The terrorist had become a peacemaker. To one friend at the time of the treaty, he wrote a chilling prophecy. Think, what have I got for Ireland? Something she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? I tell you this, I have signed my death warrant. 6 months later, near his home in County Cork, Michael Collins lay dead on an Irish roadside, a bullet through his head. His death was the work of fanatics who considered him a traitor who sold out to the British. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children waited in line to pay their respects as Michael Collins lay in state in the City Hall beside Dublin Castle. Among them, many British soldiers, his former enemies, wearing black armbands on their uniforms.
As a child, my mother, who was a niece of Michael Collins, she didn't talk much about him when we were children because her memories of him were too sad. In his short life, he became synonymous with the struggle for independence from the British in Ireland. But he was written out of Irish history for a long number of years, and people didn't talk about him openly. And it's only in the last 10 years at most that Collins has become respectable, I suppose, to talk about openly.
Michael Collins was a multifaceted man. As a guerrilla leader, he conducted an effective campaign of selective terrorism and founded the Irish Republican Army. As a political leader, he drafted the Constitution of the Irish Free State. Ireland's sovereign independence was forged in blood, and the role of terrorism cannot be underestimated. But this would not be the end of terrorism in Ireland or elsewhere. Soon, Irish nationalists would be fighting among themselves, with the Irish Free State pitted against the extremist wing of the IRA, which opposed the agreement with Britain. Terrorism began anew with a familiar round of bombings, assassinations, and arson. The IRA went underground and was outlawed by the Irish Free State in 1931. It would resurface in the 1960s. The legend of Michael Collins would live on as an inspiration to future anti-colonial rebels. Following the Second World War, revolutionaries in Palestine, Kenya, and Algeria would study IRA tactics and use terrorism to achieve their goal of independence. In the 18th century, the French Revolution ignited a unique philosophy of violence, the use of systematic terror to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. In the 19th century, Russian anarchists refined the art of revolutionary terrorism, the use of selective violence to overthrow a government and change society. This, too, was new. In the early 20th century, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin developed his own brand of terrorism, ruthless violence controlled and organized by the state. Terrorists from the Middle East to Europe and South America would study these examples, informing their own philosophies of terrorism to create a legacy of violence that has haunted the 20th century.